So to continue our conversation in epistemology, last time I ended by saying that any knowledge claim that is ultimately based on one's own being, oneself, will end in either philosophical skepticism or solipsism. So in this brief video, I want to take the time to define those two terms and explain how it is so. How it is that if you do not begin your thinking with the God of the Bible, with Scripture proper, how you will end up in meaninglessness, nothingness. Right? This is a key theme in Solomon's writings, particularly in the book of Ecclesiastes, when he continues to mention that everything is vanity over and over as he goes through all the different disciplines and spheres of life, and he has a PhD in all of them. Consistently, we get back to this point that he mentions over and over, right? That under the sun, all of it is vanity, right? That word hebel, it is smoke, right? It is nothingness. And then he ends by saying, what? Remember your Creator in your youth, fear God, and obey his commandments. He's giving us far more than just a simple moral lesson. He's actually giving us the key to life. And the key to life is that through all the trials, temptations, through all the different chaos and confusion of different worldviews and ideas, ground yourself and your thinking in the Alpha and Omega, the beginning and the end. Ground yourself in the personal triune God, and your thinking begins with him, and you can make sense of life then. And of course, he uses that to show how when you're grounded with God, when you begin with him, right, when you presuppose him in order to prove his existence, life makes sense. So let's go back then to our term, solipsism, right? Solipsism is very simply the idea that everything that is exists in your mind alone. You cannot escape your own mind. You are trapped within it. Descartes plays with this idea when he goes over his argument to prove how little he knows and to doubt everything. He gets at this concept, this analogy he uses. It, we call it in philosophy the brain in the vat, right? The Matrix as a movie plays on this idea. How do you know that everything is not just an emanation from your mind? How do you know that everything is not simply your perception? You see, if your knowledge claims begin with your own experience, the way you've interpreted things, you're left with a dilemma. You're left with the dilemma, the fact that I don't know what's going on in your head. I don't know what you experience or sense. What you call pain could be very different from me. In fact, it often is, even when statistical analysis is done on these types of things. What you see as white could be brown to me. We see this all the time when such experiments are done. When people look at color, they see it quite differently. How do you know that there is a world outside of your mind if everything comes back to you? If when I'm asking somebody, okay, the sky is blue, and I say, how do you know? And they say, well, because my eyes tell me so. And I say, why do you trust your eyes? How do you know they are reliable? And the answer is something along the lines of, because they've always proven themselves reliable. You're stuck in that circle, right? We call it begging the question, circular reasoning in philosophy. Well, you're stuck. You're trapped inside. Everything that you see and you hear and you experience is what you see and you hear and you experience. That word you is so important. How do you know that it's not all being produced by your mind? Or by your brain, if you want to take a materialistic route? How do you know that everyone else around you and everything that is in this world is not actually emanating from your mind, being produced by you? And in fact, we see with many philosophers, when they've taken the idea of empiricism, right, that everything begins with sensory knowledge to its logical conclusion, many of them end up in solipsism, and their conclusion is that they are God. How does a tree make a sound if it falls in the woods and no one's there to hear it? Well, no, because you are actually the one creating the tree falling. As you turn that corner, that stuff is literally coming into existence, the sounds, the smells, the sights, because you are producing it through your own God-like divine perception. It's an inescapable conclusion. If you want to go a materialistic, empirical, atheistic route, you will be left in either solipsism or philosophical skepticism. And they're very closely linked, but philosophical skepticism ultimately is saying that no knowledge, no absolutes are possible to know at all whatsoever. We can't know anything at all. right? This is the claim that some of the ancient Greek philosophers actually made. They were a minority amongst the Greek philosophers. They were certainly labeled as the radicals and the weirdos, and there was all kinds of different names called these types throughout history. But the one thing that often the tradition of philosophical skepticism saw very clearly was that if we're going to begin with ourselves, if we're going to begin with our experiences of any kind, whether it's an intuitive experience, a sensational experience, maybe some type of irrational experience, it all ends up being reduced back to the self. And we are little blips in existence. And as Kant and others have shown us repeatedly, we simply don't know anything about the world truly in and of itself based on our own experience. All we encounter is this phenomena. We encounter the wall in the room as orderly and unified. We don't actually encounter the chaos of molecules that are moving rapidly at that very microscopic level, at the quantum level. We don't see it. We perceive something that's orderly. You hear words that are somewhat intelligible that are coming to your mind, your head, as I speak. Maybe you don't understand all the concepts. Maybe you don't agree with me. Nonetheless, the basic concepts and the basic words have meaning, and as you've listened, it's allowed you to hear me intelligibly. Well, how does that happen? How do we explain that? If everything is grounded, if knowledge itself is grounded in us as finite, limited, ever-changing creatures, well, we're ultimately left in absolute skepticism. There's no way of knowing anything for sure. Will the sun rise tomorrow? It's a probability, Hume showed us, but we'll never know it with any kind of certainty. Will I be the same being tomorrow that I am today? Some philosophers would say it's probable. Others, like Sartre and the existentialist, would say, no, you are ever-changing and completely different from who you were yesterday. And when we look at these claims and we follow them through, what we are ultimately led to is utter skepticism, absolute skepticism. Can we know that 2 + 2, 2 and 2 = 4? No, we cannot. And we can't because there's no universal laws. There's no universal being that holds all of these, that maintains a standard of truth. In fact, we would say he is truth itself. He is the standard. But when the standard is ultimately gone and all knowledge is grounded in the experience of this tiny, finite, material or immaterial being, there's no way of applying anything that we think we know beyond ourselves, and we are left in utter skepticism. Why communicate? Why speak? Why have a belief or an opinion at all? Because it's utterly different from what everyone else experiences, from what everyone else claims, and certainly how they would claim to understand it. You will never know how somebody else perceives hot, how somebody else perceives cold, how somebody else experiences the sun or love or pain or sadness. None of us will ever understand another person's experience because we are, by definition, not them, at least on one philosophical standing point. And so if everything begins with us, we will either end up in, well, then we are divine. Everything is an emanation of our own perception, and this world literally does belong to us. We are God. Or we end up in utter philosophical skepticism where there is no knowledge or no truth possible whatsoever. It's not to say that there isn't truth out there, but the philosophical skeptic who is logically concise and actually far more honest in his atheism will acknowledge that we can never know anything with any kind of truth or certainty at all. So what's the point? Insanity becomes the only logical conclusion for any form of epistemology that is not grounded in the personal, triune, covenantal God. May the saints be equipped.